Hi, I'm Cameron Bailey, the Artistic Director and Co-Head at TIFF, and I'm going to lead a conversation today about policing on film. You think about the history of film, you think about Keystone Cops back in the silent era, all the way up to Dirty Harry, Kindergarten Cop to Bad Lieutenant. The police are everywhere in movies. Now that videos of police violence have become so frequent, critics have focused our attention on TV shows about policing. Cops and Live PD have been pulled off the air in some cases. But what about the movies? How have our imaginations been shaped by the hundreds of hours of beat cops and detectives and police chiefs and everything that we've consumed at the movies? How have both fiction and documentary films painted a picture of policing for us, and what has that picture left out? We're going to break it down, and we've got three of the best minds on this that I could ever imagine. Nataleah Hunter-Young is a writer, film programmer, and PhD candidate. She's supported festival programming with the Toronto Film Festival, the Hot Docs International Documentary Festival, and the Durban International Film Festival in South Africa. She's completing her doctorate on the social and cultural impacts of social media videos, documenting anti-Black police brutality and their representations in contemporary art. Dr. Courtney R. Baker is a specialist on the impact of visual culture in Black life. She's an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of California, Riverside. Her book, Humane Insight, Looking at Images of African American Suffering and Death, was published in 2015. She's written essays on African American film, the history of the image in African American activism, and the ethics of narratives about death. Clement Virgo is one of Canada's foremost film and television directors. His debut feature, Rude, premiered at the 1995 Cannes Film Festival. His other films include Lie With Me, Poor Boy's Game, and The Planet of Junior Brown. And on TV, his credits include The Get Down, Empire, The Wire, The L Word, American Crime, and the OWN TV network drama Greenleaf, on which he also served as director and executive producer with Oprah Winfrey. He also directed and co-wrote a 6-part miniseries adaptation of Lawrence Hill's The Book of Negroes, which debuted to record-breaking numbers on the CBC in Canada and on BET in the US. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you.
The first thing I want to ask, we actually have some clips that we're gonna talk about during this conversation. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you each, what did you learn about policing from watching movies? Nataleah, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I learned that police were the authority, I think. But they were able to wield a certain amount of intimidation, and that it was allowed, but also that they were the good guys and that they were protectors, that they were smooth and calculated, like thoughtful, and that, I mean, they could be violent, but I think also movies show us police as individuals, and I think sometimes that conditions us away from understanding them as state actors and a force. And so I think when I think about how film introduced me to police, that's what comes to mind, but I do think that's evolved.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Professor Baker, how about you? What did you learn about policing from watching movies?
That's such an interesting question, because I was trying to think back, and I think my first as a child encounter with the representation of policing on screen, not just in film, was probably on Sesame Street and those kind of children-oriented shows where the messaging was about trust in authority, right? If you're lost, go to them. But I think this is something that we can acknowledge is particularly jarring for Black people as we age, that story about who we can trust in our own individual experiences, but also once we encounter more complex representations. Like if I think about, I wasn't watching film noir when I was a child, but by the time I was watching film noir, something like LA Confidential, I understood that the idea that the police were unimpeachably correct, was absolutely not the only kind of story that was being circulated or available in films.
And Clement, you're a filmmaker. You've put police officers on screen in some cases.
Yes.
What did you learn about policing from watching movies?
Well, I came of age in the the 70s and 80s, and one of the first cops I remember was Rod Steiger and Sidney Poitier in the heat of the night.
Mm-hmm.
And was really struck by that as a child, because of course when Rod Steiger first meets Sidney Poitier, he arrests him. He shakes him down because he thinks he's just a black hoodlum, and then he discovers that he's a cop from Philadelphia, and he says Philadelphia, Mississippi. He said no, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then of course go through the 70s, films like French Connection, where all the cops were white, and they were usually shaking down drug dealers, a lot of drug dealers in the 70s. And that kind of imagery of white cops shaking down or having authority over black people was an image that I think still prevails to this day. So as a filmmaker, growing up in Jamaica, in the 70s, Jamaica was a police state. So I always, associated that. I grew up in a housing project, and up until, in my mid-20s, it wasn't uncommon to get shaken down by the cops. So, I always see police in terms of authority and having to make sure that I respect their authority and respect that they, in any kind of encounter, they have the power to do what they will.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that authority comes out in almost each one of your responses, and with that comes the abuse of authority, sometimes with violence as well. I have a couple of clips I want to show on that idea of police in the movies as a kind of agents of authority, agents often of brutality as well, the cop as enforcer, which I think is maybe one of the main images we see of police in the movies. Violence, as we know in movies, is something that sells, can be very exciting to watch, and police officers are often the agents of that. Two clips here, one from Sudden Impact with Clint Eastwood, a famous clip I think most people will recognize, and the other is from Do the Right Thing.
What you doing, you pig-head sucker?
Every day for the last 10 years, Loretta there has been giving me a large black coffee. Today she gives me a large black coffee, only it's got sugar in it. A lot of sugar. I just came back to complain. How you boys put those guns down?
Say what?
Well, we're not just gonna let you walk out of here.
Who's we, sucker?
Smith and Wesson and me. Go ahead. Make my day.
Get
All right, clips from Do the Right Thing and from Sudden Impact. So you got cops as good guy, cop as hero of the film, cops as bad guys, but the acts are actually the same. The cops are acting, with just pure brutality against the people that they're dealing with in the scene. How does that work? How do cops get to be good guys and bad guys doing essentially the same thing? I don't know, what do you think, Professor Baker?
That's a really important question, and I love that. I love these clips that you've juxtaposed them, and also that this isn't the first Dirty Harry movie that we're seeing, right? That we're recognizing that is a character, right? A lot of what we know and understand and appreciate about Clint Eastwood derives from that Dirty Harry persona, right? That emerges as the cop who's doing right in the 1970s in San Francisco, right? Originally interested in the Zodiac case, which is actually about Scorpio, but also very close to Oakland, right, in the 70s, which is one of the headquarters of the Black Panthers. So undoubtedly, a lot of the imagery and the imagination about what San Francisco looks like during this period is informed by the presence, the justified presence, right, Second Amendment rights to bear arms, right, that the Black Panthers were exerting and trying to facilitate, right? Also, though, in the 1980s, we're entering into the Reagan period where we see an uptick in policing, right? And that very stark contrast between Black and white, which is also something that, in particular, in Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee is interested in exploring within that very closed environment of just one day and one block, right? Everything that can happen. So I think you do get that contrast between an establishment of a hero character in terms of Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry as the outsider cop. But I don't think that you necessarily get the same kind of sense that there's even a moral code for the police who emerge, or for many of the characters in Do the Right Thing, right? The police kind of go in, it's recognized, it's clearly configured that they're doing exactly the wrong thing. The wrong thing is to, kill someone who has done nothing but stand for peace. He's really a passive, Rady Rahim's really a passive victim in this. So it's a lot of those subtle but significant differences that also have to do with the historical and regional context that are really fascinating and that are really important when we talk about what do we mean about policing in film.
Mm-hmm. Clement, I wanted to ask you, why do you think Dirty Harry was so satisfying to watch? Why did audiences want to watch him time after time on screen kill people as a police officer?
Cameron, this literally just occurred to me as I was watching Dirty Harry. Suddenly I just realized that he's a sheriff. Mm. He's a sheriff within the Western American context.
Right.
You know what I mean? He comes out of that tradition of there is a lawlessness around him, and he's a sheriff in town, and he's going to, through force of will, he's going to be the judge and executioner in this town to kind of corral the elements. Usually, the sheriff is protecting the virtues of the town. It's usually protecting from Native Americans. That's been the imagery.
Other thing we can talk about as well.
Yeah. But I think it comes out of that tradition of this wider character, this John Wayne, because I think you could connect Clint Eastwood with John Wayne, which is someone who is uber masculine, that move through the world by their own code and is justified in creating order out of disorder. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the appeal of, and I think coming out of the Reagan era, Reagan in a way was trying to throw back to the idea of the Western American myth.
Right. Having been a part of creating it as an actor.
Exactly. So just literally just occurred to me, because it literally, it's like a show. It's like that scene is like a saloon scene in a Western.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a classic saloon scene. There's bad guys. The sheriff comes in. He doesn't have to draw his gun because his reputation precedes him. So he has all the, he and they're black. So obviously, like the Indians, they don't shoot straight. So he has all the time in the world to take out his gun and kill them.
Right. Natalie, I want to ask you about the Do the Right Thing clip. Still so powerful to watch, so painful, partly because clearly Spike Lee was basing it on actual deaths in police hands of actual black people, and the chokehold is still being used. As a movie, though, and as a scene in a movie, how does that connect with what people were experiencing in New York at the time, and what people are still experiencing in terms of police violence and the real life experience of it, as opposed to the movie version?
Yeah, I mean, it's so what are the words for the fact that this is still right? So I mean, I think, I was really young at the time that came out, but I've heard about how massive an impact Do the Right Thing had in terms of how audiences responded to it, but also thinking about it being 89, am I right? So just a few years before Rodney King, I think you can see the road to the justifiable rage, the boiling point, the tipping point, that I think was being experienced then, and something that we're experiencing now again, and have experienced in between and fear to experience again. I think it responds to back up a little bit and incorporate really what Professor Baker and Clement were saying. It taps into the fact that white supremacy has kind of conditioned us to be benign to Black pain and suffering and death, and that what I think Spike Lee is doing in Do the Right Thing is directly confronting that, particularly in that scene. I think the benign nature, I mean, is kind of a common experience. It's this kind of question of why do you need to see these videos to understand that this is something, this has existed for a long time, but also comes from a history of 2 steps past benign to something being something that folks derive pleasure out of, right? And this, I think that's what the challenge is in this film. I also find that as it relates to, so I think it does tap into and respond to the fact that Black death in the course of law enforcement is understood in this context of collateral damage, and I think that what we see in Do the Right Thing and what we see in the streets is a direct confrontation of that.
Okay. One of the other elements, and you talk about the sort of the benign image of police and policing in movies, one of the elements of that is friendship, the kind of camaraderie between cops. And there's 2 clips I want to show next. One is from Die Hard, which is actually one of my favorite movies, not going to lie, and the first Die Hard. And the other is from Training Day. Training Day actually premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. Denzel Washington won his Oscar for that. And they're both movies that have a kind of that brotherhood of policing as a part of the stories. In Training Day, it's actually the central conflict. So let's watch those clips from Die Hard and Training Day and come back and talk about that part of Cops on Screen.
It can't be like this.
It is this way, man. I'm sorry I exposed you to it, but it is. It's ugly, but it's necessary.
I became a cop to put away drug dealers, the poisoners, the criminals, not to be one.
You sound just like me. And I know what you're going through. I know what you're feeling. You're scared.
I'm not scared.
Yes, you are. You're terrified. Everybody goes through that the first time. I went through it. The sooner you can match what's in your head with what's going on in the real world, the better you're gonna feel. In this business, you gotta have a little dirt on you for anybody to trust you. And when all this is behind you, there's gonna be a whole other world that opens up for you. I walk a higher path, son. I can give you the keys to all the doors.
What are you talking about?
My guys are pretty good, but they're not leaders, they're clowns. You're a leader. You want my job, you got it. You want to lock up poisoners, this is the best place to do it. But you gotta just, take your time. You make detective, you play the game, you grow wise, and then you can change things. But you gotta change them from the inside, son. Let's go downtown to the station. You talk to my guy, Stan. And he'll walk you through what you gotta say to the DA guys, okay?
Clips from Training Day and from Die Hard. Clement, I want to ask you about those two films, the idea of the police officer who breaks the law to uphold the law. And I'm asking you also because you directed a couple of episodes, famous episode of The Wire, which is all about this as well. So that kind of moral dilemma that we seem to enjoy watching on the big screen and the small screen. Can you talk a little bit about how that dynamic works?
When I see those clips, I think of the buddy cop movies, and I think of Eddie Murphy, in 48 Hours. Mm-hmm. I think of Danny Glover in Lethal Weapon. Mm-hmm. I think of Chris
Tucker.
Chris Tucker in Rush Hour.
Yeah.
So I see that within the sort of and Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor could have started it, which is the wisecracking, badass black guy paired with the kind of honky white cop in a way. You know what I mean? That's coming out of the 70s, leading into the 80s. And so I see it within that context where in a way the black cop in some ways, for the most part, they play the kind of trickster, in these movies. But so that is the kind of the context I view, and Denzel Washington took the Chris Tucker, Will Smith, Eddie Murphy idea and flip it in a way to be the ultimate kind of, badass, smart, wise mouth, smart black cop with his white cop, And I did a scene like you said. I did a scene in the Wire where it was a black cop and a white cop, and all they say is fuck. And you have the straight man, and you have the comedian. And the black cop is usually the comedian. He's usually the one that is making you laugh and making you feel comfortable. And it's a way of showing a kind of solidarity, and a way of showing the kind of the blue wall that's in the police department. That somehow, in a way, it's kind of beyond race. For it's about this fraternity and brotherhood of cops.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, Professor Baker and Nataleah, about that sense of, the police officer as the one who's got the most complex moral landscape to navigate. That's their job, is to kind of find a path between good and evil, to do the right thing and, do the wrong thing to achieve the right ends, all those kinds of things. And it's a kind of complexity that often isn't given to their victims and other characters in the movie. So, what does that do to us as viewers if we see policing as kind of the most morally complex job there is?
I'll dive in. Not that I'm going to solve that question, but that that question about the interior life, right, of the police officer has been such rich fodder, and I don't mean correct or the only fodder, but I mean that idea, beyond even the actual designation of a character as a good cop or a bad cop or even an official cop, right, motivates the tensions behind film noir, which a lot of film critics understand as being about this crisis in the wake of, for white America, but for a lot of folks, right, the world turned upside down in the wake of decolonization movements, in the wake of World War II. So I think that a lot of those questionings about the moral complexity aren't necessarily about the police per se, but about larger questions that we engage in culturally about what is right and what is wrong and how those are shifting, right? So if looking at the dates that Training Day and Die Hard comes out shows us a lot, right? I think Die Hard comes out, as Clement was saying, it's part of the buddy cop colorblind push that we get in that period, right?
Which wasn't colorblind at all, of course.
Right, which isn't, right? But they're really working to really sell that. But then the 90s happen, and then you get the hood cycle of films, right? You get Menace to Society. I don't think that you could get a Training Day. I don't think there's any way that you'd get to Training Day without Menace to Society, even with the specific location in South Central LA, right? With the sound of the helicopters. What does it mean for Black communities to be surveilled and policed and observed, right? So I think that the complexity and the questions of the morality do have to do with a kind of, we're also talking about major productions, right? And those studios are still existing in the wake of this false logic that Black points of view will not sell. So you can't completely alienate, right? This would be the thinking. You can't completely alienate an audience, a constituency that is convinced that the police are doing always the right thing, right? So yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Mm-hmm. Nataleah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this might be where I get controversial. Because I mean the questioning, I think you're right, drawing attention to like the interior lives of cops and the moral kind of conundrums that they're faced with is a really common occurrence in how cops are portrayed in film on screen. But like, I don't see cops as moral actors. I don't see them as individuals. Police are a unit of force, an army. They act as one. They are trained to do so. They back each other up. There is no room for moral conundrum for their lives, right? Like they can be left in some really dangerous situations if their brothers in arms don't back them up. So I think screen culture has certainly distorted that reality.
This is an interesting point, because if I understand you correctly, policing is an institutional activity, but movies treat it as an individual activity, a personal moral dilemmas.
Exactly.
And that actually helps kind of, I don't know what the word is, but helps create the problem that we're dealing with, which is we actually see police as individual actors when in fact they're not.
Right, and that the bad cop in the duo is eventually rooted out.
Mm-hmm.
The good cop prevails, right? The cops can, and this I think is where the logic of the police can be trained out of their violence comes from, as if violence isn't core to their work. It is meant to, in theory, it's supposed to be a response to violence, with violence, to avoid us having to, potentially us having to confront that violence. So yeah, I think screen cultures have distorted our understandings of policing and its role in society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a really interesting point to reflect on, actually, as we continue to watch cop movies, because they are certainly not going anywhere. I want to shift over from fiction to documentary, though. There have been many documentaries that address policing, and I also, because we've been dealing so far with American films, I want to bring it home to Canada. One of the films I return to often and returned to just about a week ago was a film by Jennifer Hodge and Roger McTear called Home Feeling, Struggle for a Community, that the National Film Board made in 1983-84. And it's about Toronto's Jane Finch community, which is certainly at the time in the 80s and maybe still now, is a community populated largely by people of color, by immigrants, large Black community there, and people who are often struggling to make ends meet economically because of all kinds of some systemic reasons. And the film shows how the police interacts with that community. I've got a clip from Home Feeling, Struggle for a Community. We'll watch that and then come back to talk about documentaries and policing.
15,000 residents live in the government-subsidized housing of the Ontario Housing Corporation. The concentration of OHC housing here is among the highest in Toronto. As part of their routine patrol, the police walk the corridors of the Ontario housing buildings just as they do the public sidewalks.
Anything else for us today?
Tenants allege that they have discovered police searching their apartments without warrants, with keys obtained from the housing authorities.
There was no problems here. They all went out on the street.
Around January.
For these tenants, the relationship between OHC officials and the police is viewed with suspicion, especially by the youth. In one building, half of the 1,500 tenants are under 19. But properly supervised recreational facilities are few, and complaints about noise and vandalism are frequent. During the summer, the kids with nowhere else to go use the corridors and elevators as the streets of their indoor city.
That's from Home Feeling, Struggle for a Community by Jennifer Hodge and Roger McTear, National Film Board of Canada film that is still unbelievably relevant in terms of surveillance, in terms of policing in Black communities and communities of color. Nataleah, maybe I'll go to you first. Someone who lives in Toronto, is dealing with both film culture and policing culture. You look back at that documentary from, almost 40 years ago now. How does that look to you compared to what you see today?
The same, except perhaps You add 30-ish years and probably no institutional betterment of the conditions folks had to contend with at that point. And so, worse. I think particularly about the Jane and Finch community's recent call, against the Toronto police force's insistence on putting surveillance cameras around the community. That documentary is, I watched it again today because before this, it is so frustrating, especially the scenes of the police walking through the hallways, and to hear that residents have experienced them coming into their apartment and searching it while they weren't there. I think it speaks to the conditions to which Black life is expected to contend, right? There is this, we can watch that and be enraged, but the police expect everybody to understand why they must do that, And I think that gets at the problem, this broader understanding of or commitment to the criminality of Blackness, and how that is inescapable as a child. You want to find a place to play and to walk to your friend's apartment or something like that, and you must be at any point ready to confront police. It's absurd, right? And it also I would love, the folks who are watching this from Toronto, think about in Rosedale, what it would be like to have the cops walking into your home and patrolling the hallways. What would that experience be like if you were unable to escape that, right? So, documentary offers this ability to subvert, right? And so, obviously, all film, all screen work offers that opportunity, but documentary does this other thing of at least attempting to offer you the real, whatever the real is, the truth, whatever that is. And I think in that added element, you can get to subvert even more, perhaps, reorient the perspective. Mm-hmm. I think particularly, what I was talking about in terms of the police as a unit and as an individual, in this case, the following the police through the hallways in this and referring to them as the police. It's very, she's quite intentional, the narrator, in presenting them as a force, as a observer who has free reign to patrol the homes of individuals, and that it is just to be expected and is entirely normalized in how it happens, and that's the very fact that it's normal should be enraging in and of itself.
Their existence in that neighborhood. Professor Baker, you've talked a lot about the subjectivity of police in fictional films, but when we get to documentary, Black filmmakers, in the case of Home Feeling, get the opportunity to actually turn the camera around on police in a different way, maybe in a way that's related to how people are using their camera phones now, just to document what police officers do, what policing is in their own communities. What do you think the value is of just observing policing as a Black subject?
Well, it's certainly something that the Black Panthers recommended that we do, right? That they established a cop watch program as being part of how Black people get free. And it is really striking that because I haven't seen the entirety of that documentary, but its commitment to that observational mode. Even the voiceover is very kind of spare, right? It doesn't rely on even the interiority of children, but it relies on us recognizing Black children as children, right? With even like the low angle shot, like the child's point of view. So I think that there are connections then between that kind of the National Film Board documentary and say a bystander video where someone is, if there is a voiceover, someone is providing it on the fly. But usually, I think if it's in the moment, even with the earlier examples of the bystander, and I think there is a utility to distinguishing the bystander video from the documentary. If we go back to the Rodney King case, right? Because I think that part of the bystander video, part of the difference is the immediacy. You get some of that from the documentary, that this is a crisis, right? The social problem film. This is something that needs to be addressed now. So I would say, I think that the documentary can give a broader picture of the structural issues. And to return to what Nataleah was saying, which I think is just a brilliant key point, which is to recognize and to see the ways in which police and policing is operating as a force, as an institution, acting upon spaces and bodies, right? And not just individual actors, which is something that may even get left out of the bystander video, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful idea to hang on to. Clement, we're going to begin to conclude by looking at a couple of clips. One is from your movie, Rude, from 1995, and the other's from The Hate U Give. What's that?
Oh, I just want to seeing that documentary again is those clips are quite powerful because I could have easily have been in that documentary because I grew up in Regent Park, which is a similar community to the Jane Finch corridor, and being and having those cops, in your hallways was something that was commonplace. Having the cops stop you and search you, So and what was and I remember distinctly that we would always Regent Park is bordered between Shooter Street and Gerrard Street in Toronto, and just in Gerrard Street, just north of Gerrard and Parliament, there's a neighborhood called Cabbagetown. And what's interesting about it is that Gerrard Street, there was literally like one street. The cops were never patrolling Cabbagetown.
Because on the other side of that street was a wealthy neighborhood, Cabbagetown.
Yes, it was like literally, literally right next to a neighborhood where obviously a lot of new immigrants from the 50s, 60s, and 70s came to Canada from the great sort of immigration wave that came during the Pierre Trudeau era. Ended up in places like the Jane Finch Quarter in Regent Park. So anyway, I just wanted to it just brought back memories of living in that community.
Yeah, and I think anybody who lives in an apartment building or a condominium tower, whether it's in Toronto or anywhere else, if you can just imagine police officers regularly just walking through your hallways and stopping you as you go in and out of your home, asking you, what you're doing there and searching you, that kind of thing. That was, and is in some cases just normal behavior that has become, has to be accepted.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And can I just add that to the word that comes to mind is overseer, right? That the police are operating as overseers, and it reminds me, Saidiya Hartman, in that beautiful book that came out, Wayward Lives, talks about the inner city, right? This modern construction as really being constructed as an extension of the plantation. Right. So it might be a housing project, but you still have overseers, right? And there's still a particular logic about which bodies need to be monitored and who gets to monitor those bodies.
Right. There's a KRS song. Who wants to go back to that as well? Clement, I want to show a clip from Rude, and I think we've got a clip from the HBK as well, because in both cases we're dealing with Black police officers, which we've touched on a little bit here. But you had Melanie Nichols-King in Rude play a cop who's got her own dilemmas to deal with, and The Hate U Give, based, of course, on the very popular young adult novel, is about people living between worlds. You know, a teenage girl living between her Black neighborhood and her white school. Police officer played by Common, who's trying to, articulate the police's perspective on things, but knows that he's also responsible to his community. So let's look at those clips and we'll come back.
What are you doing here?
I came to see you. I came to see my son.
When did you get out?
This afternoon.
Why did you call?
I had no money.
Not even a quarter?
No.
So how'd you get here?
I walked. You a cop now, or you still a cadet?
I'm a cop now, and I gotta get to work.
It must be rubbing off on you. You sound like a cop.
Why didn't you accept any of my visits?
I didn't want to see you.
You didn't want to see me?
Look, it's me.
Yes, it is.
Reese, look, it's me.
Yeah, it don't even look like you. Sure it does.
So why'd you show up here?
You're here. My son is here.
So you planning on staying?
I have nowhere else to go.
So what do you want from me? You want me to take you back? Is that what you want? Are you going back to dealing?
No.
Are you gonna go back to fucking dealing? Better not go back.
Now, when it happens, don't act mad. You gotta look calm. Answer their questions, but don't tell them nothing extra. Keep your hands out your pockets. You drop something, leave that shit where it's at.
Maverick.
Leave that stuff where it's at. My bad. Now, one day, y'all gonna be with me, and you best bet we gonna get pulled over. Now, that don't mean I did something wrong. Maybe I made a mistake driving, or maybe I ain't do nothing at all. You gonna see me with my hands like this on the dashboard. Come on. Now you keep your hands posted, because moving makes the police get all nervous. If I ain't with you, you ask for me. It can get real dangerous, so don't argue with them. But keep your hands where they can see them. This how you gonna act. We straight?
I was 9 years old when I first got the talk. 7, my half-brother, was 10. Sakani was 1.
Now, just because we gotta deal with this mess, don't you ever forget that being black is an honor, because you come from greatness. Now, this is the Black Panther 10-point program. This our own Bill of Rights. I want you to learn it, because I'm gonna ask you about it, I'm gonna quiz you.
Really, Maverick?
Know your rights. Know your worth. You understand?
Powerful, both of them. Clip from The Hate U Give, and before that from Rude by Clement Virgo. Your movie from, 25 years ago now. Want to ask you about that character in particular. This is a police officer who's also part of the community, who has a history with someone who is a criminal by her perspective, dealing drugs. And again, one of those conflicted characters, but this time a black cop. And does that complicate it even further?
Yeah. At the time, I was really fascinated by this notion of policing your own community. You know, what would it be? You know, because I think a lot of young people, and I know for me at the time, was that kind of dilemma. You know, where you want to be a part of the kind of dominant structure, right? Which this character wants to be, but still feel like you're marginalized outside of the system. And I was interested in the dilemma in such a character, and very similar to the character Common plays in The Hate You Give. And in a way, you know, the first badass cop we've seen on screen, you know, Shaft. You know, Shaft had a kind of, you know, up in Harlem.
You forget he's a cop.
You know, yeah, you're right. You forget that Shaft is a cop, but Shaft was a cop and was quite moral, and he had to figure out how to navigate his own community while policing them. And so, you know, I was curious about that, and it's, you know, and still a kind of dilemma, because I think within our own community, we are suspects of someone who's assimilating within the sort of dominant social structure, like a cop. We still hold them under suspicion, and it's still, you know, I find it sort of fascinating.
All right. We're going to have to wrap up, but I just want to ask Nataleah and Professor Baker about that idea of policing one's own community as a black member of a police force, especially because from what I know of statistics anyhow, and I could be, this might not be true in every case, but in major cities in North America, police officers often don't actually live in their communities, but they're policing communities they're not a part of. But that idea of policing your own community is a very sort of powerful, dramatic trope. Can you talk a little bit about how that circulates in films compared to maybe what the reality is?
Professor Baker, if you want to.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it quick. I was really struck by a couple of things in those magnificent scenes. One is the vector of gender, right? And how thinking about who gets rescued and saved, we've talked about how that breaks down along racial lines and also age, but also gendered, right? Who expects to be the authority and who can expect to be rescued. But also, I'm reminded of Pam Grier's character, right? That there's policing in the Black community, and then there's caring in the Black community, right? And those are two different things, right? It's in Foxy Brown that Pam Grier organizes to help her community with an organization that is not it is a vigilante organization, but it's called the Anti-Slavery Committee, right? Right. So there are and have been and always will be, I think, hopefully more and more alternatives to policing, right? Where we can get to look after our own.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think there's there's an allure to power, for sure. And I wonder also if part of that allure is hoping to be protected once being a cop, right? But I also think that perhaps for many the draw to policing is to think that you can care from that position in a way that perhaps you can't without that authority, or that somehow you can be the intermediary between that authority, the violent authority that as a Black person you might be aware of, or you're likely aware of, but that that allure of the space to make moral decisions and to do care, to practice care. I think a major challenge that screen culture offers is how it restricts the imagination as it relates to how to offer safety and security and create that in a space, and create that kind of instill that sentiment among the community. I think it boxes us into believing that policing is the only way. But like Professor Baker, I also hope that we can start to foreground the ways that we care for each other every day, all the time, in really formal and institutional ways, but then also in the completely informal, because I think that's where the opportunity comes to have a better world, right? And so I look for those opportunities in film for sure, where and I think sometimes that's embodied in the character, who's facing that dilemma, understanding the care, wanting to care, but then also having, what in Rude they say, oh, so you're a cop now, right? Like you have to negotiate those identities. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I look for the opportunities where care negates policing, I guess.
Mm-hmm. We know that the movies aren't real, but policing very much is. And I think what's been great about this conversation today, it's obviously a vast topic. We were only getting to the surface of it or to parts of it, but I think what it's helped me understand anyhow is how policing on film affects how we view policing in the real world, and some of the tensions between the individual agent who can make a difference and make a change in a movie versus the institution of policing as it functions in the real world, and how we have to think about these as we watch these movies, because they do help shape how we think as well. So I want to thank you all for helping generate this conversation. It's been really productive. Nataleah Hunter-Young, Professor Courtney Baker, and Clement Virgo, thank you.
Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you, Cameron.
All right.